Hey guys, so I am going to remind you about how to tell whether or not a graph is a function or no. And what we're typically used to doing in math class whenever we're given a graph is to look at whether or not it passes or fails the vertical line test. So just as a reminder of what that means, remember that if you can draw, ooh, that was a really bad example. Remember, if you can draw a vertical line through the graph and you hit it in two places or more, that means that it fails the vertical line test, and that means that it's not a function. So you guys did a really good job of that earlier in the year, remembering that. So this graph, for example, does not pass the vertical line test, which means that it's not a function. However, you're going to frequently see on math tests, including hint, 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 maybe your final exam, that it might be multiple choice and there might not be the words there passes the vertical line test. So you might see wording that involves something like this. So remember that the input is your x value. And remember that the output is your y value. So you might get something like this. So you're used to saying, no, this is not a function because it fails the vertical line test. But remember that these 2 points, which also make it fail the vertical line test, have the same input. And the reason they have the same input is because they're right there on the same x value, which if I zoom in here, notice it's to the left 1, 2, 3, which means they both have the same x value of -3. But then notice they have a different y value because this one is all the way up here and then that one is all the way down there. So these have the same input. In other words, they had the same x value, but they had different output. So that is probably another reason that you might be seeing in your future that this is not a function. Another way it might be said is that you have one of the inputs. So again, in this example, one input. And again, in this example, that input we're talking about is -3 because both of these coordinates have an input or an x value of -3. Have two, or I shouldn't say have, that's really bad English grammar, sorry. One input has 2 or more inputs. So that's another way. You know how in math we people always like to say the same thing like 8 different ways. So that's another way that we might explain why this fails the vertical line test, and again, why it's not a function. But the overall reason is still the same, that no, this is definitely not a function. But I've just explained to you a couple ways that you're going to say exactly the same thing, just with different words. Now let's compare that to example number 2, where, as again, you guys are used to, this one actually passes the vertical line test. Because if you draw a vertical line through all those coordinates, it only hits in one place. So you know for a fact that yes, this is a function. But depending on the test, including your final exam, again, hint, 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 what you might see, instead of it saying failing the vertical line test, it might be something more in line with what you're going to see in Algebra 2. So notice that each one of these has a completely different x-coordinate. Remember, the x-coordinate is where it is on the x-axis. So for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This x-coordinate is -8. This one's -5. This one is -3, and then this one is +3. So they're all different x-coordinates. So that's another reason that it's a function, is because they're all different x-coordinates, because they all fall along different places on the x-axis. But another thing that you might see on a test is yes, but the reason is each input gets one output, which is true. Personally, I feel like the easier thing to say is that all the inputs are different, which is why we've talked about that in class. But you are definitely going to, but this is like the Algebra 2 way, which will be explained at a later date why they use this reasoning. So each input gets one output. So either you need to say it's multiple choice, that you have an input that has two or more outputs, or each input gets one output.